Imagine yourself in the skin of Maria, a 43-year-old accountant who has spent her entire professional life balancing the ledgers of others, only to find her own life's ledger erased by a stroke of a government pen. Living in a pleasant apartment nestled within the upscale Palermo district of Buenos Aires, Maria is the quintessential portrait of success. She holds a prestigious degree from the University de Buenos Aires and spent years meticulously curating a life that signaled upward mobility. 18 months ago, she drove a brand new Renault off the lot, financed on credit. In 1998, she and her husband channeled their savings into a small vacation property outside Mendoza, certain that its value would climb alongside their ambitions. These possessions, along with her closet of fine clothes and a high-end home theater system still being paid off in installments, were the bricks and mortar of her personal fortress. To Maria, these weren't just objects. They were the structural pillars of a carefully engineered existence. But on December 1, 2001, the Argentine government initiated the Corralito, an icy seizure of the nation's liquidity that effectively trapped Maria's hard-earned capital behind a digital wall. Suddenly, the woman who once managed complex corporate finances was restricted to a humiliating withdrawal limit of just 250 pesos per week. As the government abandoned the peso's peg to the US dollar, the very currency in her pocket withered, losing roughly 70% of its purchasing power in a matter of weeks. The social fabric tore as quickly as the currency. Outside the Casar Rosada, the air turned thick with tear gas as police clashed with crowds of retirees who had nothing left to do but bang empty pots in a rhythmic scream for justice. While supermarket shelves were stripped to the bone by desperate citizens, Maria stood in her living room, surrounded by everything she owned. It is a haunting realization. Your assets remain in place, yet they have been rendered functionally worthless by a reality your professors and financial advisors never dared to describe. This systematic betrayal targets the exact demographic that played by the rules, revealing that obedience to a crumbling system is the most dangerous investment one can make. In this state of quiet decay, the outward appearance of civilization persists even as its internal organs fail. The grocery stores stay open, yet their price tags are revised every few days, rendering a steady paycheck irrelevant. The banks remain standing, yet they serve as little more than vaults for money they refuse to release to you. Your house stays upright, but it becomes an anchor because no buyer exists to take it off your hands. Your car remains functional in the driveway, but its utility vanishes when the cost of a single tank of fuel exceeds your entire daily wage. This is the primary mechanism of collapse. Not physical destruction, but a fundamental dislocation. It is a moment where the delicate thread connecting money to reality snaps. The price signals that once dictated whether you should save for a vacation or buy a new television transform into static noise. When these signals fail, the purchases you made in good faith become stranded, physically intact but economically dead. The patterns of these failures are never random. They consistently target the very purchases the middle class was most aggressively encouraged to make, the assets framed as responsible investments and milestones of progress. To understand the gravity of this, we must approach the list of failed purchases not as a series of guesses, but as a clinical autopsy of a dead economy. We shall examine them one at a time, beginning with the asset that invites the most visceral public resistance: real estate purchased at the wrong point in the economic cycle. The resistance to this idea is rooted in a deep-seated mythology. Modern society has been conditioned to believe that land is uniquely real, that they aren't making more of it, and that property value is subject to a natural law where prices only ever move upward. Your home is your greatest asset. These commonly held maxims are not immutable laws of nature, but rather a collection of fragile beliefs that can be shattered when subjected to the weight of history. To understand the danger of these convictions, one must stress test them against the cold reality of past collapses. Consider Japan in 1991. Following a decade defined by extraordinary asset inflation, the Japanese real estate market peaked at levels that were, in hindsight, purely hallucinatory. At the height of this mania, the grounds of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo were famously valued at more than the entirety of California's real estate. The Nikkei index had soared to atmospheric heights, and credit was so abundant that families were encouraged to sign on for 100-year mortgages. These were literal multi-generational debt contracts, Yet the public was told that such a move was wise, that Japan was structurally different, and that prices only moved in one direction. A similar drama unfolded in the United States leading up to 2008. Between 2003 and 2006, American households absorbed roughly $4.5 trillion in mortgage debt, fueled by federal policy, loose lending standards, and a cultural apparatus insisting that homeownership was the American dream. In cities like Las Vegas, Phoenix, and parts of Florida and California, home values doubled in just 3 to 4 years. Families stretched their finances to the breaking point with adjustable-rate mortgages, interest-only loans, and speculative second properties. When the market reversed, prices in those volatile regions plummeted by 40%, 50%, or 60%. Between 2007 and 2014, approximately 10 million Americans lost their homes to foreclosure. That's not a statistic. That's a population larger than most European countries. The demographics struck with the most surgical cruelty in these moments are rarely the reckless speculators. They are, instead, ordinary families who happen to purchase a home at the precisely wrong historical juncture, utilizing loan structures they were assured were standard in a market they were told was impenetrable. However, a significant distinction exists between a standard recession and an outright economic collapse. In the latter, real estate does not merely decline in value, it becomes functionally useless. This is not due to physical decay, but because the invisible financial architecture supporting the asset, the banking systems, the income streams, and the credit markets implodes. This mechanism is essentially a financial anchor that turns a home into a cost center rather than a refuge. Maria's experience in Argentina mirrors this. Her Mendoza vacation home, acquired in 1998, saw its dollar-denominated value stripped by roughly 60% by 2003. In a national emergency, recreational property has no market. She was left pouring money into a hole, paying maintenance and local taxes on a dead asset, waiting for a recovery that, for many, would not arrive in their lifetimes. The illusion that a house is a liquid asset that can be converted to cash at will vanishes exactly when that cash is required for survival. That is the trap. The second purchase that economic collapse renders useless is the automobile. Specifically, the new automobile purchased on credit. While real estate holds the crown of middle-class mythology, the automobile is the true silent killer of household balance sheets because it is the specific asset into which the majority of families are most heavily leveraged at any given moment. To understand how a machine of freedom transforms into a mechanical cage, consider the case of Venezuela. Back in 2012, before the full acceleration of the national economic collapse, citizens were purchasing vehicles at record-breaking rates. Major global players like Chevrolet, Toyota, and Ford maintained a massive market presence, and auto loans were a standard feature of daily life. In an environment where prices were already creeping upward, the car was viewed as a status symbol, a functional necessity, and a brilliant store of value. The prevailing logic was simple. Buy the car immediately before the currency loses more power and prices skyrocket again. The tragedy of this logic became clear by 2016. By that time, the Venezuelan economy had contracted by more than 30%, while annual inflation exploded past 800%. The automobile, once the proud emblem of middle-class stability, metamorphosed into one of the most useless objects in the nation. It was not a lack of desire to drive that killed the car. It was the total disintegration of the automotive ecosystem. Despite Venezuela sitting atop the world's largest proven oil reserves, refinery mismanagement and structural collapse meant that fuel simply vanished. Imports dried up alongside foreign currency, making spare parts non-existent. Maintenance became a luxury beyond reach, with a single set of 4 new tires costing more than a typical worker earned in an entire year. Insurance policies were reduced to scrap paper as providers could not settle claims in a currency that died a little more every hour, while the very roads crumbled from a lack of public spending. Across Caracas and Maribo, tens of thousands of vehicles sat in driveways, physically intact and mechanically sound, yet utterly paralyzed. You could not drive them without fuel, you could not repair them without parts, and you could not sell them for a fair price because no one had liquid capital. You certainly couldn't keep making loan payments on them when your salary had been obliterated by hyperinflation. The utility vanished. That gap between what you owe and what an object can actually do for you is where financial tragedies are written. Cuba provides the most extreme long-term autopsy of this phenomenon. Following the 1991 dissolution of the Soviet Union, the island lost between $4 billion and $6 billion in annual subsidies almost overnight. Fidel Castro euphemistically dubbed this era the special period, but the reality was a brutal 80% drop in imports. New automobiles simply stopped arriving. While the world marveled at Cubans using ingenuity and hand machine parts to keep 1950s Chevrolets running with salvaged truck diesel engines, a quieter catastrophe hit those who had purchased newer Soviet Ladas and Moskviches in the late 1980s. These owners had signed on for favorable financing terms, believing the supply chain was permanent. Once the USSR vanished, parts for those specific models ceased to exist in the Western Hemisphere. Within a few years, these modern marvels became nothing more than yard ornaments. The owners, once considered privileged, found their net worth indistinguishable from those who owned nothing at all. This reveals a critical truth. A car is not a self-contained island of value. It is merely a single node in a vast, fragile network. For a vehicle to function, it requires a refining infrastructure for fuel, international supply chains for parts, a functioning financial system for insurance, and a solvent government to maintain the roads. If you sever one of these systemic arteries, the asset begins to wither. Sever 2 or 3 and it is dead. It becomes 2 tons of silent metal and plastic haunting your driveway, acting as a physical monument to the wealth you used to possess. And here is the critical detail. The people most devastated by this shift are not those who bought aging beaters with cash. Those who bought new cars on credit remained legally shackled to payments for a vehicle they could no longer fuel, insure, or repair. Credit-based ownership of complex technology is a high-stakes gamble on the permanence of the entire global order. The debt remained, but the actual utility of those assets vanished into the ether. This chasm between legal obligation and practical survival is the exact landscape where middle-class destruction takes root. We must now turn to a category of acquisition that most people consider the absolute pinnacle of prudence. This includes life insurance, annuities, pension contributions, and retirement accounts, the entire spectrum of long-term financial instruments sold on the solemn promise of future protection. Examining these products provides the cruelest autopsy of all, because these were the choices made by the most responsible members of society. These were the individuals who delayed gratification, sacrificing their present consumption to build a fortress of future security. In every systemic collapse, these people suffer the most because they are the ones who trusted the system most unconditionally. Think about what that means for a moment. Weimar Germany serves as the foundational case study for this specific betrayal. Before the outbreak of World War I, the German nation boasted one of the most sophisticated and modern insurance and pension infrastructures in Europe. The system was regarded as an efficient and reliable machine of social welfare. Workers and families dutifully funneled their earnings into retirement schemes and life insurance policies denominated in marks, believing in the permanence of the institution. Between 1921 and 1923, however, hyperinflation completely dismantled this trust. By November 1923, a life insurance policy that would have purchased a full house in 1914 was worth less than a loaf of bread. This is not a metaphorical comparison. It is a literal historical fact. Technically, the insurance companies fulfilled their obligations by paying out the face value of the policies in marks, but those marks had lost all meaning. A policy with a substantial payout of 20,000 marks in 1914 would be paid out in 1923 in a currency that could not even secure a copy of the daily newspaper. Savers were made whole on paper while being utterly destroyed in reality. The same fate befell pensions. Civil servants, teachers, professors, and military veterans who had earned defined benefit pensions through decades of faithful service received their promised payments. The payments simply couldn't buy food. An entire class of people who had done everything right, who had served the state faithfully, who had saved and planned, were reduced to poverty not by fraud, not by theft, but by the mathematical consequence of currency debasement. The history of modern fiscal desperation reveals that private savings are often the first casualty when a state faces collapse. Argentina serves as a hauntingly contemporary example of this betrayal. In 2008, the Argentine government, buckling under severe fiscal pressure, nationalized approximately $30 billion in private pension funds. These assets, meticulously accumulated by individual workers over decades, were managed by private administrators known as AFJPs. With a stroke of a pen, the state seized these accounts, folding them into the public pension system under the hollow promise that benefits would be maintained. In reality, the government systematically understated inflation to mask the truth. The purchasing power of those payments was being devoured year after year. Diligent contributors realized too late that their supposedly protected accounts were merely a slush fund for general government spending. The promise of retirement remained, but the value behind it had completely evaporated. The mechanism here is specific and important, and it repeated with even greater cruelty in Lebanon starting in 2019. In what was once one of the most banking-heavy economies in the world, the financial system effectively confiscated the life savings of its citizens. People who held accounts denominated in US dollars, assured by their banks that these funds were a safe haven, suddenly found their wealth trapped behind informal capital controls. Withdrawals were either blocked entirely or forced through at artificial exchange rates, imposing haircuts of 70%, 80%, or even 90% on the original value. The banks were not burned to the ground. Their buildings stood tall and their logos remained polished on the glass doors. However, they were essentially hollow shells. The money was gone, lent out to a sovereign that could not repay within a system that had remained insolvent for years while continuing to lure in new deposits. Long-term financial products are promises. They are contracts that say, "Give us money today and we will give you money in the future." But that future is a gamble on a currency holding its value, an institution remaining solvent, and a government refusing to change the rules of the game when economic conditions inevitably shift. We must then confront the fourth purchase rendered useless by systemic failure, one that modern society treats with almost sacred reverence: the university degree. To be clear, knowledge itself is never useless. The innate ability to think, analyze, and understand complex systems retains value in any environment. However, a university degree is a credential, not the knowledge itself. It functions as a beacon or a signal sent into an employment market to communicate that a program has been completed and that the holder is eligible for a specific category of labor at a certain level of compensation. This signal only holds value if the specific employment market it was designed for still exists. The post-Soviet era of 1991 stands as a stark testament to this dislocation, where the landscape of labor was terraformed overnight. Engineers found themselves navigating the streets as taxi drivers, and elite physicists were reduced to hawking mundane goods in open-air markets. Perhaps most tragically, university professors, the intellectual stewards of the nation, were frequently out-earned by uneducated street vendors. It was not that their education had suddenly made them stupid or incompetent. Rather, the entire systemic lock their education was designed to fit had been replaced with a completely different mechanism, leaving their meticulously crafted keys useless in their hands. A similar tragedy unfolded in Greece following the 2010 crisis, where youth unemployment skyrocketed to a staggering 60%. The figures for university graduates were described in terms nearly as grim. This was a nation that had invested heavily in its collective intellect, with families sacrificing their life savings to send children to prestigious institutions at home and abroad, specifically in the United Kingdom and Germany, at an enormous financial cost. These students returned with hard-earned degrees in law, architecture, finance, and business administration, only to enter an economy that had absolutely no use for their skills. Between 2010 and 2015, an estimated 200,000 young, educated Greeks were forced to immigrate to Germany, the UK, and Australia. Greece effectively paid the massive bill for their training, while foreign nations reaped the economic harvest. Families were left with nothing but the crushing debt and a profound, permanent absence. Spain followed an identical script after 2008, where unemployment for those under 25 exceeded 55% as the economy contracted by nearly 10%. They were dubbed the Generation Perdida, or the Lost Generation, the most educated cohort in Spanish history, trained for a world that had vanished. This reveals the true mechanism of educational investment. A degree is a high-stakes bet on a specific economic structure. It assumes that the industries existing at enrollment will survive until graduation, and that the salary premium associated with the credential will persist. Most crucially, it assumes that the debt you take on will be repayable from the income the degree generates. In a stable economy, the assumptions underpinning professional investment generally hold firm. However, during an economic collapse, every one of those foundations fails simultaneously. Industries do not just slow down, they restructure entirely or vanish. The salary premiums once commanded by degree holders compress until they disappear. Most devastatingly, the debt used to finance that education remains nominal and unyielding, a fixed weight that refuses to shrink even as the income required to service it evaporates. Graduates are left holding a piece of paper that cost 4 years and tens of thousands of dollars, euros, or pesos, a credential for a job that no longer exists in a country that can no longer afford to employ them. It is critical to recognize that the degree did not fail. The specific economic architecture it was designed to serve failed. Consider Zimbabwe between 2007 and 2008. As hyperinflation accelerated toward a terminal velocity of 79 billion% per month by November 2008, a desperate consumer behavior emerged. People spent their Zimbabwe dollars immediately, knowing that holding them for even 24 hours meant a total loss of purchasing power. They hoarded unnecessary goods not out of desire, but because any physical object served as a better lifeboat than the currency. Yet, the physical goods themselves soon disintegrated. The electronics broke and stayed broken because imports had ceased, leaving no spare parts. The appliances failed and sat as dead monuments because every qualified technician had already fled the country. The ecosystem required to sustain these objects had vanished, proving that wealth stored in complex consumer goods is only as durable as the society that maintains them. In Lebanon, after the 2019 crisis, this pattern reemerged within a different register. The middle class in Beirut had been legendary for their enthusiastic consumption, luxury retail, and vibrant restaurant culture. Families carried massive amounts of consumer debt, from credit cards to installment plans and personal loans. This debt was denominated in the Lebanese pound, a currency they were told was stable, pegged to the dollar, and backed by a robust banking system. When that peg finally broke, the LBP lost over 90% of its value, yet the consumer debts remained immovable. The credit card bills arrived on schedule and the installments remained due, even as the income to service them was gutted. A salary that once provided a comfortable lifestyle now barely covered basic nutrition. Renovated kitchens and designer furniture sat there, unsellable in a stagnant market and utterly irrelevant to the daily struggle for bread and fuel. This is the mechanism that people most struggle to understand because it contradicts the most basic consumer instinct. In a stable economy, buying goods feels like building a life, but in a collapsing economy, those same goods are merely anchors. They represent weight that ties you to a place you might desperately need to leave. They consume the very maintenance resources required for your own survival. They represent spent capital that can never be recovered. And if they were purchased on credit, they represent ongoing obligations in a world where your ability to meet those obligations has been destroyed. Now step back from the individual categories and look at the pattern. Real estate, automobiles, financial products, educational credentials, and consumer goods form the 5 pillars of middle-class identity in virtually every modern consumer society. They are the items you are instructed to buy. They represent the checklist of success, stability, progress, and responsibility. Buy a home, acquire a car, get insured, get educated, and furnish your life. What do these 5 categories have in common? In every economic collapse across every continent and every decade, they are the specific categories that fail first and most completely. This is not a coincidence. It is structural. The middle class is, by definition, the class most thoroughly integrated into the formal economy. The wealthy possess diversified assets and international holdings in hard currencies or real assets that transcend national borders. The poor have little to lose, often operating in informal barter networks and cash transactions that do not depend on institutional stability. But the middle class is fully invested. Their wealth is tied to a mortgaged home, their mobility to a financed car, and their security to an institutionally managed pension. Their future depends on a degree leveraged to a specific labor market, and their very identity is fueled by credit-based consumption. Every single thread that holds the middle-class life together runs through the formal financial system. And when that system breaks, every thread snaps simultaneously. Every one of those acquisition milestones was, in reality, a hidden gamble. It was a bet on currency stability and institutional solvency. It was a bet that the labor market would persist and that the government would honor every single one of its commitments. Most fundamentally, it was a bet that the system in its entirety would continue functioning long enough for the purchase to deliver its promised value. In stable times, these bets pay off for decades, eventually appearing not as risks, but as absolute certainties. This long-term stability acts like a fog, causing an entire class of people to forget that they are fundamentally exposed. Then the system breaks, and all those bets are called simultaneously. The cultural narrative surrounding economic collapse suggests it is a phenomenon reserved for poorly managed nations or countries that make unique, avoidable blunders. This is a dangerous fallacy. Before its fall, Weimar Germany was the most culturally advanced nation in Europe. In 1913, Argentina was ranked among the 10 wealthiest countries on the planet. Lebanon was once celebrated as the Switzerland of the Middle East, and Venezuela possessed the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. Even Greece was a member of the European Union, backed by the European Central Bank and integrated into the most sophisticated monetary union in human history. None of this status mattered when the structural integrity failed. When the underlying mathematics of a system break, they break with a cold indifference, and every trust-based purchase built upon those equations breaks alongside them. I need to be clear about what this analysis is not saying. It does not advise you to avoid buying a home, shun an education, or stop saving for your retirement. In a functioning economy, these are often the most reasonable and strategically sound decisions available. What this analysis is saying is that you must understand the actual nature of what you are buying. You must recognize the embedded assumptions in every transaction. Every long-term financial commitment is, in its purest form, a bet on systemic stability. That stability has never been guaranteed, and the historical record on this point is unambiguous. This is the hidden mechanism that drives modern life. The very system selling you these products is the same system whose continued stability those products depend upon. Consequently, it has zero incentive to warn you of potential fractures. It has every incentive to reassure you relentlessly. This reassurance is pumped through every possible channel: advertising, government policy, cultural messaging, and the entire vast apparatus of modern consumer capitalism. The message never wavers: buy, borrow, commit, extend, and lock yourself in. The system operates on the premise that it will always be stable, right up until the moment it is not. The survivors of past systemic failures understood a fundamental truth. There is a profound distinction between consumption and resilience. While most were distracted by purchasing items that felt like comfort, the resilient focused on maintaining capabilities that would actually function under intense stress. They operated with the cold realization that the rules of the game are malleable. A contract that seems written in stone can be rewritten overnight by a desperate government. The currency in which your life savings are denominated can be gutted by a central bank with no other options left. Even the institutions holding your retirement funds are not safe. They can be nationalized in an instant by a parliament that needs the money to plug a fiscal hole. These are not paranoid fantasies born of cynicism, but documented, dated, and quantified historical events that happened to real people who never imagined such a betrayal was possible. Consider the aftermath for Maria in Buenos Aires as the calendar turned to 2003. The worst of the crisis had technically passed, and the economy had reached a state of stabilization. Maria was alive and housed, and she was certainly not among the most impoverished citizens. Yet, the wreckage of her former life remained. She still owned her apartment, but its market value had plummeted to 50% of what she originally paid. She still had her car, though the running costs were now barely affordable. Her life insurance policy paid out its full face value, but in the new reality, that entire sum bought exactly 2 weeks of groceries. Her vacation home sat empty and unsold, slowly accumulating tax liens. Her degree still hung on the wall, a physical object representing a career that no longer existed. She was working again, but not as an accountant because there was no longer any demand for one. Instead, She performed administrative duties for an export company, earning a mere 1/3 of her pre-crisis salary in a currency that bought only a fraction of what it once did. Maria learned a lesson she will never unlearn. Every purchase she was told was smart, stable, and responsible turned out to be a high-stakes bet placed on a system that failed. These purchases were not irrational. They were perfectly rational within the system that existed at the time. However, the system did not hold, and when the foundation gave way, nothing built on top of it could survive. There was no single villain to blame. Instead, there was a flawed incentive architecture and a set of interlocking promises that assumed permanence in a world where no such thing exists. The system was not designed to betray Maria, but it was designed in a way that made betrayal inevitable once specific conditions arrived. The historical record shows that these conditions always arrive somewhere eventually. The only question is whether one recognizes the pattern before being swallowed by it. The pattern is already in motion somewhere right now, and the goal of dissecting the past is to make these patterns visible before they become personal. If that kind of clarity matters to you, staying informed is the only way to remain ahead of the curve.